Okay, so this is the last week of class before spring break, so I don't have an intense amount of stuff prepared. One more was really in-class essay. Our first synthesis essay for this semester. And I've held off on this just because most of you did very, very well on the last synthesis essay from last semester. And I kind of felt like, we were in a pretty good place with that, made some good progress there. But I want to get back to that. And I'm going to have A-Day group do the synthesis essay on Tuesday. But B-Day group, you're going to take it on Thursday. So you don't have to worry about taking it digitally. I think I like the idea of you having a physical copy of the document. So I've made time for both groups to do that in class. So the only reason you'd have to complete that on your own is if you are absent. All right. So we'll also have a vocab quiz. So going from a vocab quiz, right into a synthesis essay, starting to try and get some endurance prepared. Since you will have to, take all three of these essays back to back. And after we get back from spring break, there will be one time where I do give you 2 essays in one class period to start trying to prepare that kind of mental endurance. Let's see what else. So yeah. Oh, and then another progress check. So this one, A-Day group, you will have to take on your own. So try and use the skills we developed and those predictions and everything that we worked on with 6 and 7 and transfer that to 8. And B-Day group, obviously, you will take that with me. And yeah, the only other stuff is some content that I'll be sharing on Monday. So John Lewis, who passed away this year, July of 2020, is a pretty legendary figure in terms of civil rights movement as well as recent politics. So he's been involved in the political world for many years after he kind of got his start working with Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And yeah, so he's definitely got a mythos surrounding him. So first I have a YouTube video, which I'll let you watch on your own, so that I don't violate any copyright things by including his video in my video or anything like that. That's about 6 minutes or so. And then I've got some of his final words. So he published an essay just before he passed away, and he asked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to publish it 4 hours before his funeral was to start. So these are the final words of John Lewis. Obviously, feel free to pause this video and watch his video first so you can see a little bit about him and who he was and how he was involved in the civil rights movement and how he got to start with that. So once you're done with that, here are his final words. While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself that, after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by 2 loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert-goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, "We are all complicit when we tolerate injustice." He said, "It is not enough to say it will get better by and by." He said, "Each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence, is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. All right, so one interesting comment, well, there's many interesting comments, but one interesting thing I thought that John Lewis kind of draws attention to is the parallels between, the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. and, modern day civil rights movement. So he referenced the Black Lives Matter Plaza. He referenced several individuals, Elijah McClain, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, who have been associated with, kind of a current push for justice and a push against systemic racism. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about the similarities and the differences between the civil rights movement, that we think of when we think of civil rights movement, the movement in the 1960s, and the movement of today, the Black Lives Matter movement, which came into existence shortly after the Trayvon Martin incident. So, took a lot of time, looking at the specifics and the details and the parallels, similar and different, between these two movements. Obviously, there's some different issues. Civil rights movement focused primarily on ending segregation and gaining the right to vote for everyone, gaining voting access for everyone. We don't have those same exact issues today, but there are some issues that were discussed during the original civil rights movement, police brutality being a big one, that are still being discussed and being highlighted today. So, some information with proper citations, of course, to talk about these two movements, in a closer lens. So, in terms of popularity, nowadays, a lot of us think, civil rights movement, well, the only people who opposed that were terrible, awful racists. But that was not the case. So as of 1961, only 27% of Americans actually thought that movements like sit-ins, freedom rides, other nonviolent demonstrations actually helped Black Americans' chances of being integrated in the South. So these methods that we think of as so successful, the Greensboro sit-in, the freedom rides that went on throughout the Southeast, they were not popular at the time. In 1964, the majority of Americans, 74% of Americans, thought that mass demonstrations like the March on Washington, which we in retrospect think of as such a success, they thought it actually hurt Black Americans' chances at racial equality. Nowadays, it's almost taken for granted that, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, March on Washington, these were grand victories. Now, to bring it to current day, as of June 28th, 2020, 65% of adult Americans supported Black Lives Matter protests. So even though there's been so much controversy around the protests, some of which have turned into, riots, looting, the majority of Americans, as of the end of June, actually did support them, which is a serious contrast to the unpopularity of the civil rights movement, at that time. 53% of Americans believe that protests, peaceful protests, of course, will help public support for equality and racial justice. So it's interesting, a lot of people now talk about, how much more controversial the Black Lives Matter movement is and how unpopular it is compared to the civil rights movement. But if anything, the truth may actually be the reverse, that, the nation as a whole, in the most part, seems to favor some of this movement, whereas they didn't necessarily back at that time. In terms of the economy, the civil rights movement had some ties to economic radicalism. They believed it was a communist movement that was trying to destroy American values. So they actually put up over 200 billboards back in 1965 to try to discredit Martin Luther King Jr. by associating him with communism and trying to insist that, he was trying to spread communist ideologies. As you may know from history class, communism was perceived as a serious, serious threat at that time. So by associating him with that, economically radical movement, it was an attempt to discredit him and take away from his ethos as a leader. Nowadays, Black Lives Matter has been accused of being a Marxist or socialist movement. A lot of politicians who support it do have some kind of far left ideologies. So think like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So because some portions of the movement may support some ideals of socialism, the entire movement has been labeled as a socialist movement. Again, kind of as an attempt to discredit it and kind of draw away from a lot of its primary goals, which, primary goals, I would say probably not so much of a socialist nature, although there are, elements in terms of trying to eradicate poverty and deal with things like that. So, criticism of leaders. So we all read the clergymen who called Martin Luther King's movement foolish, counterproductive. They said his actions were aggressive, disruptive, that he was provoking people to violent uprising in spite of his nonviolent ideology. And they urged Black Americans to reject his leadership and to deal with things at a local level. Now, one major difference between the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement is that the Black Lives Matter organization doesn't have a definitive leader. So thinking about whether this is a good or a bad thing, on the one hand, having Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader who was so committed to policies of nonviolence, who had ethos as a clergyman, as a religious leader, who was able to give the movement a voice and unify it and, oftentimes speak directly to the president and say, this is what we want, these are our goals, that can be seen as a strength of the civil rights movement, for sure. Black Lives Matter is seen as kind of a grassroots organization. Each local area, has their own very kind of loose organization. And sometimes those, little organizations may not necessarily have a a consistent vision. On the other hand, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the movement died. It was pretty much done on a mass scale kind of level. So there is less, what's what I'm looking for? In a sense, I guess there's more momentum with the Black Lives Matter movement just because it is not reliant on one person. And if that one person goes away, then the movement goes away. It's still going to exist regardless, but less of a unifying vision. So pros and cons with that one, I would say. But that's definitely one huge difference between the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the kind of current civil rights push. All right. So back in the day, many prominent politicians argued that Black Americans should be happy with what they had instead of asking for more. A lot of critics of the movement use statistics of Black on Black crime to invalidate the issues raised during the civil rights movement, saying that, well, why are you concerned about, this segregation stuff when you guys are out in the streets killing each other? That was a strategy used to invalidate the movement. And the Black on Black crime issue is something that has been brought up today quite frequently, especially when talking about police brutality as kind of a red herring, kind of a distractor. Oh, well, how can you even deal with these issues you're talking about when this is an issue? Back in the civil rights movement, Senator Strom Thurmond argued that Black people in America were better fed, better clothed, and had better houses than Black people had in any other country. No one is deprived of freedom that I know about. You are not oppressed, was kind of the message that a lot of people received, that they should be grateful for what they had. They should be appreciative of this country, which values freedom, and they shouldn't want more. All right, so even Black Americans had some issues with Martin Luther King's movement. There was a teenager who was shot and killed by a police officer following a protest in Memphis in 1968, and a Black man wrote a letter to Martin Luther King blaming him for that child's death. They wrote that, "We as a body had rather not have anything else to do with you or your so-called righteous riots." So Martin Luther King was not universally popular among Americans and even Black Americans. There was a Black evangelist who actually worked with the FBI to discredit King. So the FBI launched a campaign against Martin Luther King under J. Edgar Hoover and tried to discredit him in a variety of ways, associating him with communism, saying that he was a communist and was organizing for the communists. The FBI also investigated Martin Luther King's history of affairs. He had several affairs while with his wife, Coretta Scott King, and they tried to use that, kind of as slander to discredit his civil rights associations. So definitely not universally popular. And then violence. So from 1964 to 1970, there were a variety of riots in many cities across the country. 159 race riots occurred in 1967 alone. After Martin Luther King's death in 1968, riots broke out in over 100 cities across the country. One of the most infamous and damaging riots that occurred in the 1960s were the Watts riots. Happened over the course of about 5 or 6 days in 1965. 34 people died. It cost $40 million in property damage. They were sparked by police brutality, but the CIA investigated and found that the root causes, the root frustrations that led to that overflowing of violent tension were actually high unemployment, poor schools, and inferior living conditions. The report recommended literacy and preschool programs, improved police community ties, increased low-income housing, and upgraded healthcare services, among other things. So that's interesting in reflection of the fact that, many of the protests and riots that we've seen in 2020 are obviously occurring in the midst of quarantine, in the midst of, some of the worst economic recession that our country has seen since the Great Depression. So the circumstances that led to the riots and protests after George Floyd, it's interesting to think that maybe those things would not have happened to the same degree if our country wasn't economically stressed, if the people in our country weren't suffering from unemployment and personal frustrations on a really mass scale, it's just the right circumstances so that when that inflammatory video came out, the reactions were of a catastrophic nature in some cases. So that's some interesting parallels. Black Lives Matter, one of the mass criticisms has been that it's a violent movement. As of September 2020, a study organized by the U.S. Crisis Project, which was a joint effort by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project at Princeton University, they found that 93% of the Black Lives Matter protests have actually been peaceful, non-destructive, no conflict between protesters and police, no property damage, no looting. So from May 24th to August 22nd, there were over 10,000 demonstrations in over 2,000 locations in the United States, which is an incredible amount of activity. Out of those demonstrations, 7,750 of them were linked to Black Lives Matter. So one other, kind of root cause of demonstrations before the George Floyd incident were the, reopen our state demonstrations, reopen our country demonstrations. So those account for some of the other demonstrations that are in that tally. But even out of the demonstrations that were linked to Black Lives Matter, violence occurred in less than 220 of those locations, which is pretty incredible when you think about how much of that violence that you saw. And of course, the simple answer is, it's our media. The locations that had violence and that had uprest and arrests and things like that, well, yeah, of course, that's the stuff that's going to end up on the news, and that's our perception. So the media is probably not going to advertise, well, here's an hour of peaceful protesting, because that's boring. It's not how they get ratings. So that's one way in which we have to remember that, even if the news is genuine, that it may not necessarily be representative. So. All right, violence to discredit the movement. So Martin Luther King was accused of inciting violence, even though he tried to be nonviolent. But in 2020, many Black Lives Matter protesters object to rioters and looters, saying that these people do not represent their movement or their beliefs. So this political cartoon to the right was an attempt to, show the associations of Martin Luther King to violence, that, he's there saying, I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow, when, many people saw that his marches often resulted in violence, whether it was incited by people in his marches or whether it was incited by the police. Sometimes things did not go as planned. All right, and politics. So Richard Nixon actually capitalized on the issues with Martin Luther King's movement in his 1968 presidential campaign and tried to appeal to voters that way. So he conveyed the message that, well, if you elect a Democrat, our nation's going to fall apart. So he blamed Democrats for being soft on crime, being soft on rioters. He rejected the social programs that were trying to resolve the causes, the root causes of the uprisings. Well, no, we don't need to deal with poverty. We don't need to deal with economic issues. We don't need to deal with unemployment. We need law and order. And he was one of the first presidents to really make that law and order the centerpiece of his campaign. So we can eliminate the violence by being tough on criminals, was his message. And he really played on people's fear in order to win the vote. And he was successful because fear is a very powerful motivating factor. So even though nowadays, in 2020, had President Trump as our president, he was obviously not endorsing or condoning violence and riots in any way, but he did try to emphasize that, this violence that's occurring in Democrat-run cities, that the city itself is flawed, and that these Democratic mayors and governors and whoever, they're not dealing with the criminals in an appropriately harsh manner. So that was a slight similarity, which is interesting given that, you would think, given the fact that Richard Nixon was able to associate violence with Democrats and was able to get elected off of that strategy, you would think that President Trump would have been able to appeal to some of those same fears and the same concerns about law and order in the country in order to be successfully reelected. And obviously it didn't work out that way. So anyways, that is, in a nutshell, some of the commonalities and also some of the major differences between the movement of the past, the civil rights movement, which, when you learn about it in history class, such a success, inspirational marches, beautiful speeches, only bad people protested. It's definitely a different perception when you look at it closely, the controversy surrounding that movement. So not trying to sway your mind one way or the other, just presenting facts about both of the issues. So if you are a person who looks back on the civil rights movement as a success and as a good thing for our nation, but you perceive Black Lives Matter in a negative way, ask yourself why that is. What is there about this movement that's different? And, if you had lived in the 1960s, would you have supported the civil rights movement? Because it definitely was not as cut and dried as it seems in retrospect. So it's easy to look at history and see things in a simple fashion when the truth is often a lot more complicated. So anyways, that's kind of our conclusion to our unit on social justice and the civil rights movement and racial issues across our country. And hopefully you have thought deep thoughts and learned some things.